August 8, 1944, Normandy. General Alfred Jodl confided to a staff officer, "If only we had 100 more Tigers, this war would be over by now." What Jodl didn't know, or refused to admit, is that the problem wasn't the lack of Tigers. It was the constant presence of the Shermans. In German logic, victory would come from technical superiority, impenetrable armor, incomparable firepower, elite engineering. Tiger was the pinnacle of that belief, a steel and precision monument designed to defeat any enemy in the open. But the war would not be decided in a single duel. It would be won by a statistic. While Germany built 1,347 Tigers, the United States dropped 49,234 Shermans. This is not just a difference in numbers. It is the portrait of two opposing doctrines. One bet on the perfect machine, the other in the machine sufficient, but available on all fronts, at any time, by any soldier. This video is a cold dissection of a fatal mistake, believing that tactical excellence could win over strategic volume, because, in the end, the Tiger was the best tank of the war, but the Sherman was the winning tank. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story better than any combat image or trench report. While Germany spent hundreds of thousands of hours to build 1,347 Tiger tanks, each considered a military masterpiece, the United States dropped 49,234 Shermans, a number almost 37 times higher, not by accident, not in a hurry, but by choice. Because that was the war that the Americans decided to fight, the war of mass production. And the most surprising thing is that this avalanche of steel not only equaled German excellence, she annulled it. If you value the story that is accurately told, fact-based and supported by data, consider supporting this channel. Leave your like and subscribe. This helps us to continue revealing the wars that were won before they even began. The decision was made on May 26, 1941. Meeting in Berlin, engineers from Porsche and Henschel presented the German High Command with two competing proposals for a new heavy tank that was to symbolize the land dominance of the Third Reich. Hitler watched the performances with almost childlike enthusiasm. He didn't just want a tank, he wanted a monument on rails. The main requirement was simple and megalomaniacal. The new armored vehicle had to be immune to any enemy weapon and, at the same time, capable of destroying anything that moved on the battlefield. Armed with the 80 mm Kabuki 36 cannon, the same caliber that had terrorized the skies of France, protected by armor up to 120 mm at the front, and mounted on a complex suspension system, the Tiger would be a mobile fortress. But his biggest problem was invisible. Time. Each unit took about 300,000 hours of specialized work to complete. Hundreds of parts were needed that were machined with surgical precision, each manufactured by highly trained workers in specific factories under increasingly fragile conditions. Germany treated the tank as a work of art, and like all art, it was rare, expensive, and irreplaceable. Production started slowly. By August 1942, only 8 units were ready. When the Tiger finally reached the Eastern Front, near Leningrad, the Soviets met it with fright, but not despair. A Soviet report described the Tiger as impressive but vulnerable from behind and below. The weight of 54 tons caused mobility problems in uneven terrain, and units often stopped due to mechanical failures before even entering combat. Still, Nazi propaganda sold the Tiger's image as invincible. Allied soldiers learned to fear his name before they even saw him. This aura of technical superiority spread throughout the Wehrmacht. German officers and tankers came to see the Tiger as the key to turning the tide of the war. The mistake, however, was not in the tank itself, but in the assumption that the war would be won by engineering, not logistics. While the Reich struggled to deliver 100 Tigers a quarter, the United States, even before officially entering ground combat, was already planning to build more than 2,000 tanks a month. This difference wasn't just numerical, it was conceptual. The Americans knew they would lose tanks in large numbers, and they knew they needed to replace them faster than the Germans could destroy them. The Tiger, with its 700-horsepower Maybach engine, 8-speed gearbox, and complex interleaved track system, required constant maintenance, skilled labor, and bespoke parts. The Sherman, by contrast, used components interchangeable with civilian trucks and could be repaired by any recruit with a toolbox. It was the difference between a Swiss watch and a hammer, and in war, the hammer is often more useful. The cost was also revealing. It is estimated that each Tiger cost the equivalent of 5 Shermans. That's just in raw resources. In working hours, fuel consumption, transport logistics, and crew training, the number was even more alarming. In a single month in 1944, the United States produced 1,743 tanks. Germany, in the same period, delivered 42 Tigers. That's right, 42. A difference of almost 40 times. And this is where the break is worthwhile, because this statistic, ignored by so many German generals, screams the truth that few wanted to hear. The war would not be won by the most lethal tank, but by the tank that arrived first, fought more often, and returned to combat the next day. If you were surprised by this number, write in the comments. Logistics wins. Even so, Hitler insisted. In private meetings, he pushed for even heavier and more complex versions. The Tiger II, or Königstiger, began to be designed even before the Tiger I went into full production. The obsession with armor and firepower has turned engineering into a fetish. Officials tried to explain the paucity of results with speeches about German quality and racial superiority applied to mechanics. But on the battlefields of Tunisia and Ukraine, this theory shattered with each tank lost due to mechanical failure, jam, or lack of fuel. The most ironic thing is that the Tiger's first engagements were against an inferior enemy. In Tunisia, facing British Shermans, the Tigers had an early advantage, but quickly became preferred targets for aerial artillery. A destroyed Tiger was a strategic loss. A Sherman, a note on a spare board. German combat doctrine, based on the idea that a perfect machine would yield perfect results, ignored the central rule of modern warfare. No system is stronger than its logistics chain. General Heinz Guderian, one of the few with a critical outlook, is reported to have said in 1943, "The Tiger's problem is not to confront the enemy, it's getting to him." A phrase that sums up the historical irony. The most feared tank of the war spent more time broken, refueling, or waiting for parts than firing. In the next chapter, we'll look at how this difference in mindset materialized in factories and why Detroit, not Berlin, became the real battlefield of World War II. Because while Germany dreamed of perfect tanks, the United States was building victory at assembly line pace. In January 1942, Franklin Delano Roosevelt assembled his war cabinet and made a choice that would define the century. He called on William S. Knudsen, former director of General Motors, to lead the largest industrial mobilization effort in U.S. history. Knudsen was neither a military man nor a weapons engineer. He was a man of the factory, of schedule, of spreadsheets and efficiency. Their mission was not to create the best tank in the world. It was to create a tank that could be produced by thousands, trained in weeks, and repaired in the field with the tools of a rural mechanic. War did not require genius. It required scale. Thus was born the doctrine of good enough to win. Instead of searching for the perfect machine, the United States chose the path of viable production and put its factories to work at an all-out war pace. The Detroit Tank Armory, hastily created by Chrysler, became the epicenter of this movement. The assembly line was installed in a reinforced concrete building more than a kilometer long. He worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Women, immigrants, farmers, and mechanics formed an invisible army, producing steel while their sons fought in Africa, Italy, and soon Normandy. There, the M4 Sherman was born. A tank light enough to cross field bridges, simple enough for a kid from Kansas to learn how to operate it in 3 months, and standardized to the point that its pieces fit any other Sherman on the planet, from Omaha Beach to the Ardennes forest. Each Sherman tank was a statement of principles: mobility above absolute armor, reliability over extreme sophistication, production above prestige. It was the opposite of the Tiger in every way. Its 75mm gun did not pierce a Tiger head-on, but it was effective against infantry, light fortifications, and in a group against any armor. Its armor was inferior, but its Continental R975 engine, originally designed for airplanes, required less maintenance, accepted multiple types of fuel, and could be changed in the field in a few hours. Instead of 8 gears and sensitive gears, the Sherman used a robust transmission which could withstand heat, mud, sand, and ignorance. Its hull was welded, not cast, which reduced manufacturing costs and time. In just 3 weeks, a Sherman could go from the factory floor straight to the battlefield, and when damaged, it did not return to base. It was repaired by maintenance battalions less than 2 kilometers from the front line. Most importantly, the Sherman was not made to operate on its own. He was part of a system. American doctrine called for entire tank formations, supported by mobile artillery, continuous logistics, mechanized infantry, and air support. Tiger was a lone gladiator. The Sherman was a worker inside a colossal military machine, and this gear did not stop. From 1942 to 1945, the United States produced, on average, 20 tanks per day. By 1944, the rate was as high as 1,600 per month. The goal was not to achieve the quality of the enemy, but to suffocate it in volume. As Knudsen said, if we can't win by precision, we'll win by pace. This philosophy has spread beyond tanks. Rifles, jeeps, trucks, planes, ammunition, everything was done based on the same logic: standardization, volume, interchangeability. Germany, proud of its elite engineering, watched with disdain. Nazi officials called the Shermans walking ovens, mocked supposed American inferiority, cited the Tiger as proof of Aryan superiority. But in the meantime, the trains crossed the Atlantic, and the Allied depots were filled with spare parts, training manuals, and tanks ready to go into combat. At the front, this difference was beginning to be felt. In engagements like Kasserine, Salerno, and Anzio, the Shermans didn't win by brilliance. They won by constant presence. When one was destroyed, 2 new ones took its place. When a division suffered losses, the replacement came in weeks. Meanwhile, each lost Tiger required months of rebuilding. The Germans were trapped in their own genius, and the irony became more and more cruel. Each Sherman was despised, until the moment when 40 appeared at the same time. An American official would have summed up the concept well: we are not building tanks for museums, we are building tanks to win in 1944. And winning in 1944 meant keeping production at pace, keeping soldiers trained, and keeping the enemy at a logistical disadvantage. The philosophical difference was almost spiritual. The Germans saw the war as proof of technical superiority and individual courage. The Americans saw the war as a problem of flow, inventory, replacement, and durability. One was a duel, the other marathon. And in that marathon, Detroit turned the heart of victory. Production was so voluminous that at certain times, surplus tanks were sent for training or left as reserves without direct use. Abundance became a weapon. And for every Tiger that appeared in the field, there was a ready-made lineup of 10, 15, or even 20 Shermans, all with a running engine, full ammunition, and a supply guaranteed by convoys that crisscrossed half the planet. But there was still something more impactful. While the Germans trained their tankers in static models or simulators, the Americans used real tanks, in real fields, with live ammunition. Training was simpler, more straightforward, and faster. In the next chapter, we will see exactly how this difference in doctrine translated into actual combats, and why, for Germany, perfection would become a burden, because a tiger can win a battle, but 20 Shermans win the war. By 1943, while Henschel engineers were still tweaking the Tiger I's hydraulic systems, the Chrysler plant in Detroit had already adapted its assembly line to simultaneously produce 3 variants of the M4 Sherman. The comparison between the two models transcends technical statistics. It reveals a clash of industrial civilizations. In Germany, every Tiger was almost a collector's piece. Parts were machined by hand, calibrated one by one, with minimum tolerances. Many workers signed their parts, proud of their individual contribution. A single Tiger, while powerful, was a single handcrafted unit with slight configuration differences between models produced in different weeks. This made each repair a challenge and each replacement a specific case. In practice, the Germans were building tanks as if they were sculptures. In the United States, philosophy was diametrically opposed. Production was segmented, modular, and scalable. Each piece was standardized. The same wheels that equipped a Sherman at Omaha Beach could be used for a Firefly in northern Italy. Each chassis was identical, each motor interchangeable. More importantly, each component could be assembled by any trained worker in any factory in the country. This approach allowed multiple plants in different states to contribute to the same system of warfare. The result was brutal in numbers. A Tiger took months. A Sherman went off the line every 48 minutes. This data, by itself, nullifies any debate about technical supremacy. Because while Germany made 1 tank a day, the United States produced 30. And this difference accumulated day after day, month after month, until it turned into an avalanche. The German rigidity became even more fragile with the evolution of the Tiger. With each new version, new adjustments, new parts, new tools appeared. The Tiger II, for example, used a completely different suspension system, required new components and more hours of assembly. Sophistication, far from being an advantage, paralyzed the logistics chain. Officials complained that on some fronts, damaged tanks were waiting months for a specific part manufactured only in Nuremberg. The Americans, on the contrary, evolved without breaking the pattern. The Sherman has been adapted dozens of times. Reinforced armor, different turrets, flaming guns, bridge launchers, naval variations. And yet, all versions maintained the logic of standardization. The chassis remained the same. The logistics remained intact. It was possible to turn an ordinary Sherman into a British Firefly, armed with the dreaded 17-pounder gun, without altering the structure of the supply chain. This wasn't engineering, it was a system. Contrast also appeared in the distribution of work. Germany centralized production in large specific factories, industrial zones highly targeted by Allied bombing. The United States decentralized. Parts for a tank could come from Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, and be assembled in California. The redundancy was deliberate. If one factory fell, another took over. By 1944, the Americans operated more than 15 armored assembly centers. Germany with 4, all under constant threat. And even so, the arrogance persisted. The Wehrmacht documents extolled the quality of the Tigers as a compensating factor. The idea was that a single Tiger could destroy 3 to 5 Shermans. But even that account was flawed, because a destroyed Sherman was quickly replaced. A Tiger does not. And worse, the Shermans learned. Their crews were trained with up-to-date field reports. They knew how to flank a Tiger, where to aim, how to attract. Allied intelligence transformed efficiency into adaptation. German genius, on the other hand, crystallized into pride. American flexibility also extended to the command. Logistics officers had the autonomy to relocate parts, tanks, and ammunition between fronts, based on the tactical demand of the moment. In Germany, the bureaucracy stopped the reaction. The High Command controlled allocations, often delaying critical reinforcements because of outdated protocols. The war began to be decided by papers, stamps, and inventory lists. And in this field, the United States was 10 years ahead. The Tiger, born as a symbol of invincibility, now represented the German paradox: building the best, even if it means losing. Nazi industrial doctrine did not allow for flexibility. It was based on excellence and pride. American doctrine, on the other hand, was shaped by necessity, adaptability, and urgency. A British officer visiting an assembly line in Ohio summed up the scene accurately. The Germans build tanks as if they were creating a legend. Americans build as if they know they will have to destroy this legend. And the destruction began with the assembly line. In the next chapter, we will dive into the direct consequence of this philosophical difference: the training of crews, because a tank can be excellent, but if no one knows how to fly it, it's just steel still. And here, too, the Americans had an advantage that Germany did not see coming until it was too late. In 1944, as the Western Front roared as Allied forces approached, the difference between the armies was not only visible on the battlefields, it was present in classrooms, training grounds, and logistical schedules. In the United States, a Sherman crew was formed from scratch in 12 weeks. This included driver, gunner, loader, commander, and radio operator. Training was standardized, straightforward, and done with real tanks. At camps such as Fort Knox and Camp Campbell, recruits climbed into functional armored vehicles on the first day and trained with live ammunition from the second week on. The manuals were simple, illustrated, and focused on practical operation. The goal was clear: to train combat-ready operators, not mechanics. This allowed the US to train thousands of full crews per month, human production on a scale commensurate with industrial production. Each tank that came off the line already had a team waiting to operate it. There were no gaps, there was no waste. American doctrine saw the tank and the soldier as part of the same system, and both were trained, assembled, and sent to the front with the same speed. Germany, on the other hand, faced a cruel dilemma. The limited production of Tigers made training a lottery. Many recruits trained in wooden models or in rudimentary simulators made from truck structures. Some crews knew the Tiger only from technical diagrams before climbing into one for the first time. Already in combat, the factories, pressured to deliver the armored vehicles to the front, could not give units to training centers. And when a crew was lost, its replacement was not just a matter of men, it was a loss of practical knowledge that the Reich could not regain. The result was a front line made up of overworked veterans and ill-prepared recruits. The Tiger's excellence in this context became a burden. It required precise operation, perfect coordination, and quick technical responses. Without it, it became an expensive and vulnerable target. In the United States, the Sherman was different. Simple to operate, error-tolerant, easy to repair. Any recruit with basic knowledge of mechanics could learn their maintenance in a few days. The instructions were pasted inside the tower. Common problems had standardized solutions. And when a failure arose, the field manual itself indicated how to correct it. This reduced the time between combat and replacement. A damaged tank was removed, repaired, and returned with new crew within 48 hours. For the enemy, this created the feeling of an army that would not retreat. It was the war fought with prepared men and human strategic leftovers that Germany never had. This systemic advantage extended to the organizational structure. The Americans operated with autonomous tank battalions, where training, replenishment, and logistics were integrated. Each group received up-to-date instructions directly from the theater of operations. If a Tiger was sighted in a certain sector, all crews in the region received a memo explaining how to engage it. Intelligence became part of the ongoing training. The learning was constant. In Germany, information flowed slowly. Tactical orders went through multiple levels and often came too late. Crews knew how to operate, but they didn't know what they were going to face. And worse, the fear of losing a Tiger made many commanders hesitate to use it fully. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. Germany didn't need any more Tigers. It needed more tanks, more trained soldiers, and more operational flexibility. But by prioritizing technical glory over functional simplicity, it chose a path that did not admit mistakes. And in 1944, error was the standard. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content and continue to reveal the unseen decisions that decided battles. In a letter written in April 1945, a Wehrmacht officer confessed, "Our tanks are better, but their tanks are always there. Always." In the next chapter, we'll cross the Atlantic and enter America's floating arsenals, where tanks were not only made, but transported en masse as if they were supply boxes. Because winning the war wasn't just about building, it was about delivering. And the United States knew exactly how. June 6, 1944. In the early hours of the morning, as the French coast was illuminated by naval artillery lightning, the tanks began to move. Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious landing in history, brought not just soldiers, but an entire industrial philosophy to the beach. Within 24 hours, more than 4,000 Allied tanks were on European soil. They were Shermans, Churchills, Cromwells, flamethrowers, bridge-throwing tanks. A swarm of steel, meticulously planned, loaded by Liberty ships built in 42 days and unloaded by mobile floating conveyors. The first armoured vehicles broke through the German defences and advanced through the Normandy interior, making room for entire mechanised divisions. On the German side, 102 Tigers were mobilised to face the invasion. A small number, but still feared. In theory, each could destroy up to 5 Shermans. In practice, the equation was about to collapse, because for the first time, German engineering did not face an enemy. He faced a system. In the days following the landing, the reports of the German tankers reveal a growing frustration. In St. Lo, a Tiger commander reports that after destroying 3 Shermans, his unit ran out of fuel. 2 tanks were abandoned. The next day, the same Shermans, or new ones, returned to the road. At Carentan, a patrol found 17 Shermans positioned in defensive line. They tried to get around it. They found 12 others, supported by infantry and mortars. The Germans were fighting a hydra. They cut off 1 head and 2 appeared. It wasn't a metaphor. It was American logic in action. Each Sherman destroyed was replaced in less than 48 hours. Colonel John S. Gillum, in charge of the Armored Repair and Replacement Section, had structured a logistics network that functioned as a traveling factory. Mobile workshops advanced with the troops. They repaired, supplied, returned. Shermans with minor damage returned to combat the same day. Unused tanks became pieces. Crews replaced by new recruits newly arrived from England, trained on the same model. Nothing stopped. Germany, in turn, faced a logistical desert. The Tigers, who withstood the battles, succumbed to attrition. Fuel consumption was absurd. A Tiger could consume 500 litres in 100 kilometres. But German convoys were being bombed daily by Allied aviation. Trains destroyed, bridges cut, warehouses set on fire. A broken part meant weeks of waiting. A tank immobilized, months of inactivity. And the worst reality, the factories could no longer deliver what was needed. By July 1944, only 30 Tigers had reached the Western Front. Meanwhile, the Allies landed more than 1,500 Shermans that month alone. The equation was immoral, but effective. With each new Tiger, there were 50 Shermans ready and 50 more on the way. German superiority, previously felt in isolated duels, disappeared in the open field. In battles such as Villers-Bocage and Hill 112, the Tigers made an impact but were soon surrounded, forced to retreat, or rendered useless by damage. German doctrine called for precise maneuvers, supporting artillery, aerial reconnaissance. But all this was missing. What there was improvisation, scarcity, and the feeling of being swallowed by something that could not be measured. German soldiers began calling Sherman's convoys an iron anthill. They were always on the move, rising from the flanks, occupying every abandoned village, advancing in the rain under fire without stopping. Behind the scenes, the Allied command operated like a machine. Each armored division had spreadsheets with daily targets for advancement, fuel consumption, and operational loss rate. Each casualty was noted, every replacement planned. The theater of war was treated as a production line on foreign soil. There was no improvisation, there was execution. And the most surprising thing, there was plenty of it. The Allies had tanks in reserve. They had extra pieces. They had enough supplies to keep the offensive going, even if the resistance was doubled. And it wasn't, because the resistance was breaking. German morale sank with each convoy destroyed, with each Allied advance. The idea that Tiger could turn the tables was starting to seem comical. Heinz Guderian himself, in a bitter report, wrote, "We have excellent machines, but we have no means to move them. In the heart of Normandy, war has ceased to be a duel and has become arithmetic. With each field taken, more Shermans were unloaded. With each Tiger lost, the Reich bled. With each mobile workshop set up, the Allied advantage increased. And tanks no longer fought just for meters of territory. They fought to prove which system could sustain a long war." In the next chapter, we'll get down to the level of gears, because the real victory wasn't in the gun or the armor. It was in how and how quickly each machine fought again, and here, even the screws counted. Early in the Normandy campaign, Allied commanders began to notice a pattern. Tigers, who managed to escape an ambush or survive a direct confrontation, invariably ended up abandoned days later, not for lack of courage, but by mechanical collapse. The genius of German engineering became, in the face of the constant friction of war, an insurmountable obstacle. The complexity of the Tiger, which made it superior on paper, was a logistical disaster on the field. Its system of interlocking wheels, although advanced in theory, required successive dismantling for a simple repair. To replace an inner wheel, it was necessary to remove up to 9 others. Its highly specialized Maybach engine consumed fuel like an airplane and required parts made in specific factories, many of them located in cities already under Allied bombardment. The transmission, with its 8 gears and precise gears, could only be removed with the help of cranes, rare and vulnerable. In practice, any damage that immobilized a Tiger for more than 24 hours condemned it. It became a stationary monument and soon became a target for artillery or was destroyed by its own crew so as not to fall into enemy hands. Meanwhile, the Shermans operated on a different logic. They used engines originally designed for trucks or airplanes, such as the Continental R975 Radial, which could be retired and replaced by field mechanics in a few hours. Its parts were standardized and interchangeable between models. It didn't matter if the tank came from Arkansas or California, each module fit into the other. American mobile workshops, staffed by trained engineers and operating in adapted trucks, accompanied the armored columns like shadows. Working 24 hours a day, in rain, fire and mud, these teams dismantled, adjusted and returned tanks to the front line with a speed that the Germans did not even understand. In many cases, a damaged Sherman in the morning was already operating again before nightfall. This difference has created a new layer of superiority, availability. A Tiger might be technically unbeatable, but it spent more time repairing than combat. The Sherman, on the other hand, could be damaged again and again, and still came back. An available tank is worth more than a perfect tank. This was the equation that the war was revealing, and this was the reality that German soldiers were beginning to understand. In letters and testimonies, many confessed to feeling helpless at seeing entire columns of Shermans advancing day after day, even after supposed local victories. A destroyed tank meant little. The American supply line brought another, and then two more. The defeat came in waves. And the most ironic, American robustness, initially seen by the Germans as a sign of technical inferiority, came to be feared. The Shermans continued to function in conditions where the Tigers broke. They marched for days without heavy maintenance. They crossed rivers with minimal adaptations. They withstood light and medium damage without compromising the mission. They were not invulnerable armored vehicles, but they were persistent machines. The Tiger needed perfection to operate. The Sherman needed only fuel and orders. In practice, the Wehrmacht began using its Tigers with increasing caution. The fear of losing an irreplaceable unit meant that commanders held them for decisive moments that often never came. Some Tigers have gone weeks without entering combat, awaiting maintenance or appropriate escort. Meanwhile, the Shermans crossed villages, faced resistance, and fought their way through with their mere presence. Tank warfare became a war of presence, and the American presence was constant. The end point of this turnaround came with a simple number. It is estimated that, over the course of the entire Normandy campaign, more than 65% of the lost Tigers were abandoned due to mechanical failures, lack of fuel, or inability to repair. They were not destroyed in combat. They surrendered to their own complexity. In the next chapter, we'll look at how the Germans tried to compensate for this reality by investing in new superweapons, and how this only deepened the logistical chasm that would engulf them. Because when maintenance conquers fear, even the most feared tank becomes obsolete. By the end of 1944, the Tiger was no longer a tank. It was a monument. Motionless, lonely, covered in snow or mud, he rested in the forests of the Ardennes, on the slopes of Monte Cassino, in the open fields of Ukraine. The weapon that was supposed to dominate the battlefields had become a steel statue, often abandoned not by tactical defeat, but by inability to function. At Kursk, the largest armored engagement in history, dozens of Tigers stopped before they could even meet the enemy, pinned down by mechanical breakdowns, jams, and lack of fuel. At Monte Cassino, a Tiger positioned as a fortress was hastily evacuated when supplies failed to arrive. The German doctrine, which bet everything on technical superiority, found its limit not in the cannons, but in the schedules and in the numbers. The German tankers continued to fight with courage, but the heroism was beginning to sound tragic. They fought alone, without replacement, without parts, without fuel. The Americans, by contrast, didn't just replace tanks, they replaced entire battalions in a matter of weeks. The Tiger had been born as a promise. No enemy would resist its 88mm gun, its sloped armor, its commanding presence. And in direct combat, that promise still held, for minutes. But war was no longer an arena of duels. It was a production field. And in the field of production, the Tiger was defeated before it even arrived. Each unit required more than 300,000 hours of work. Each piece was unique, each substitution an event. The United States, on the other hand, in that same year, had produced 17,947 tanks. Of those, more than 14,000 were Shermans. That's right. In a single year, the Americans made more tanks than Germany did in the entire war, a statistic that the Germans ignored until it was too late. If this data surprised you, leave it in the comments. Logistics wins, because in the end, it was she who won. The collapse was not just material, he was philosophical. Nazi doctrine, shaped by Hitler's vision of a war decided by the ultimate weapon, did not envisage an adversary with the ability to absorb losses and continue advancing. When the Tiger ceased to be functional, there was no plan B. There was no backup unit, no other tank coming from the sea. There was, indeed, a soldier surrounded, desperately trying to get a gear to turn again, and often This gear was heavier than his entire battalion. American commanders began to identify the abandoned Tigers as geographical landmarks. They were used to indicate routes. Turn left on the burnt Tiger. The perfect machine had become a point of reference, and that said it all. The Wehrmacht tried to react. It introduced the Tiger II, even heavier, even more armored. But the American response was even more subtle. They adapted the Sherman's chassis to dozens of different versions, including the Jumbo with extra armor and the Firefly with a British 17-pounder gun, capable of frontally piercing a Tiger at more than 1,000 meters. And of course they continued to manufacturing at an all-out war pace. In a confidential 1945 report, a German officer wrote, "We are being defeated by production. Our tanks are worth more than theirs. But they have too many tanks." And this perception was not only bitter, it was the harbinger of the final collapse. Because in the last year of the war, even the Soviets started ignoring the Tigers. They started to bypass them, leave them trapped, and advance straight into the heart of Germany. In the next chapter, we'll look at what happens when even the enemy stops fearing his greatest weapon and starts using it as an obstacle to ignore. Because the true end of a doctrine is not destruction. It is irrelevance. In the quiet corridors of Munster in 1945, as the last officers recorded the armored losses of the Third Reich, a statistic began to circulate among American commands. Of the approximately 8,000 crews who operated Tiger tanks during the war, about 6,000 died in combat. This represented a mortality rate of 75%. They were not cold numbers, they were names. Trained, experienced men, many with dozens of successful missions, killed inside machines that, while technically superior, were not meant to save them. German philosophy had been clear from the beginning. The gun was the center of doctrine, the soldier, his operator, the tank, an extension of the glory of the Reich. Each Tiger was treated as a strategic asset to be preserved at all costs, and this cost increasingly was paid in human lives. Crews were instructed to hold out to the end, even when retreat was feasible. Many died with no chance of evacuation, trapped inside burning carcasses, trying to keep a machine running that no longer made sense in the field. On the American side, the philosophy was different. The Sherman, with its lighter armor and higher profile, was in fact more vulnerable to frontal impacts. But his operational doctrine called for retreat, flanking, constant movement. And more importantly, it foresaw the life of the crew member as a priority. Tanks were designed with wide hatches, clear evacuation routes, and rapid abandonment protocols. In many battles, damaged Shermans were evacuated within seconds, with crews rescued by infantry units or other tanks. The machine could be lost, not man. This was reflected in the numbers. Although the Allies lost thousands of tanks, the survival rates of American crews remained consistently high. In battles such as Falaise and the Ardennes, more than 70% of the crewmen of the damaged Shermans survived to fight another day. Many operated 2, 3, even 4 different tanks during the war. They were not martyrs. They were recycled combatants, living pieces within a gear that knew how to preserve what mattered most. This difference, although technical on the surface, hid a moral abyss. Because while Germany sacrificed its best men to keep its ideal machine moving, the United States built enough machines to ensure that its men came back. The result was evident: an army that marched with survivors, not legends. American heroes did not die on the field. They survived, adapted, returned. The Germans, even in local victories, buried irreplaceable talents. Every Tiger crew lost was a strategic loss. Not only because of the machine, but because of the tactical knowledge, the field experience, the impossibility of replacement. The Reich killed its own specialists trying to protect the symbol of its doctrine. The impact of this logic extended to the morale of the troops. In 1944, many German soldiers began to express a recurring feeling, the fear of dying trying to protect something that could not protect them. The Tiger, with all its grandeur, had become a prestige trap. American soldiers, on the other hand, knew that their machines could fail, but that the system would not abandon them. Workshops, evacuation, air support, supply, everything converged to keep man alive. And that made a difference in combat. The soldier who knows he can retreat fights smarter. He who knows that he will be abandoned fights with despair. In the post-war memorials, this irony was consolidated in bronze. On many German monuments, statues of tigers rest as ghosts of a glorious past, while the names of fallen heroes are etched into plaques that few visit. In Allied cemeteries, the names of survivors are remembered alongside those who fell, because the real victory is not only in who wins the fight, but in who survives to tell it. And perhaps, at this point, lies the greatest irony of all. The nation that extolled human superiority sacrificed its best men trying to save tanks. The one that prioritized enough, saved its men, and won the war. In the next chapter, we will cross the Atlantic again to understand how this logic was applied on a naval scale, and how the United States created, in record time, a fleet of transport ships capable of fueling an all-out war. Because it's not enough to win with tanks, it is necessary to know how to take them to where history will be decided. When engines froze on the plains of Ukraine and tires cracked north of Leningrad, German generals still believed they were winning. Columns of panzers advanced with precision, tigers roared in the icy forests, and intelligence reports spoke of favorable numbers. But behind the smokescreen and snow, something was moving silently and furiously. The Soviet Union, while fighting, watched. And while he suffered, he learned. The factories in Chelyabinsk, Gorky, and Nizhny Tagil began to change their pace. The Soviet doctrine, until then marked by intensive but disorganized production, began to follow a new model. Not a German model, but American. The T-34, the Red Army's main armored vehicle, was redesigned based on the principles that made the Sherman a strategic weapon: ease of maintenance, mass production, operational simplicity. The armor has been tilted to maximize protection with less steel. The 76mm gun was replaced by an 85mm version without significantly increasing weight. Each T-34 could be built in 3,500 hours, nearly 90 times faster than a Tiger. In 1944, Soviet factories achieved a feat that few thought possible: 2,000 tanks per month, with peaks of 2,400 at certain periods. It was the communist application of the Sherman style. Germany now faced no longer only the Russian winter, nor only the depth of Soviet territory. He faced a force that had absorbed the American lesson and multiplied it. The T-34s came in waves. They had flaws, yes. They were cramped, rough, and often sent to the front with still fresh paint. But they came back, or rather, they were replaced. With each unit destroyed, another one emerged, the same, functional, ready. The German tankers, once confident in their abilities, began to notice the same pattern that the Americans were already imposing in Normandy: the endless repetition of an enemy that seemed to have enough tanks for every field, every road, every hill. Soviet doctrine also changed. Just as the Americans trained crews en masse with a focus on efficiency, the Soviets created accelerated training centers. Recruits were instructed with simplified models, repetition of maneuvers, and visual manuals. It was not necessary to be an expert. It was necessary to know how to operate, aim, and survive, enough to keep the tank functional for weeks of combat. When a T-34 was lost, its crew was replaced by another within days. The aftermarket chain functioned as a continuous line of human and mechanical parts. The Germans noticed the difference. Wehrmacht units reported that newly conquered positions were being attacked again in a matter of hours. Cities taken in the morning were besieged again at night, And when they captured a T-34, they soon realized it was practically identical to the previous one. Same panel, same turret, same weld. It was the enemy industrializing, and the cruelest thing was the enemy winning with the same logic that the Reich had despised. The irony was palpable. While Hitler demanded increasingly heavier, more complex tanks, with armor up to 180 mm and cannons capable of piercing 200 millimeters of steel at 2 kilometers, Stalin authorized his factories to produce enough with the sole objective of not stopping. In a meeting with officers of the State Defense Committee, he was blunt. "We need tanks that our men can drive on the march, not monuments." And so it was. Production did not stop even under attack. Assembly lines ran under snow-covered hangars, with workers working in round-the-clock shifts. One T-34 left ready, while another was tested alongside, still under the sound of bombardments. And that surrender, continuous, relentless, had a devastating psychological impact. The German tankers, even when they won, knew it was temporary. With each successful ambush, with each enemy column destroyed, they knew that this was only the first wave, and that another would come, and yet another. The Tigers, increasingly rare, no longer had fuel. The Panzer Fools, although versatile, no longer had parts. The enemy, on the contrary, seemed to have invented a machine of infinite repetition, and in a way, he had made it up. It was the same American logic, applied on Soviet soil, with more brutality but with the same result. In 1945, when the Allied armies advanced from the west and the Soviets from the east, Germany was crushed by two similar concepts: quantity with purpose. The Shermans came down the Rhine, the T-34s by the Oder, and each tank was part of something bigger than its armor or its gun. They were tools of a logic that Hitler never understood. Winning was not creating the best. It was to create what was enough and multiply until the enemy couldn't take it anymore. In the next chapter, we'll get into the heart of this steel empire in motion, the American factories that didn't stop for a second during the war, and how they, on their own, could have beaten the Axis even without firing a single shot. Because in the end, whoever produces the most wins. In February 1945, in the ruins of a devastated village near the Moselle River, a group of German soldiers took shelter behind a tank that had never been made for them. It was a Sherman M4A3, abandoned days earlier by the Americans after a misfire. The German crew, part of a rear unit, had recovered, patched and reconfigured. They painted a makeshift black cross over the white star and put him back on the front line. It was not a symbol of achievement, it was a sign of desperation. What the German High Command had called American disposable metal was now their last hope for resistance. The phenomenon was not isolated. With each mile back, reports grew of captured Shermans being used by Reich forces, not out of fetish or technical vanity, but out of sheer necessity. Tiger's supplies had ceased. Panzer production had collapsed under Allied bombing. Shortages of parts, fuel and maintenance had turned German armor into useless ghosts. But the Shermans, these were still running. They were easy to turn on, easy to fix. They had robust engines, interchangeable parts, legible instructions, and most of all, they were everywhere. German soldiers began improvising repair teams with translated manuals, learning how to handle the tanks they had once snubbed. The irony was unbearable. Veteran officers who had proudly served in Tigers now drove enemy tanks, praying that their silhouettes would not be mistaken for targets. In some cases, captured Shermans were used in ambushes against Soviet and American convoys, desperate maneuvers that were short-lived but revealed the terminal state of the German war machine. Nazi propaganda did not know how to react. It was impossible to hide the records. Troops photographed next to enemy tanks, mechanics trying to decipher American engines, generals admitting to using Allied vehicles in internal reports. The discourse of technical superiority, sustained for years as a pillar of German military ideology, collapsed in the face of the crude reality. Even the enemy manufactured better. The tiger, once a symbol of invincibility, had been reduced to a museum statue, admired but inoperative. The Sherman, who never promised perfection, now served two armies. It was the universal weapon of World War II. This moral reversal has taken a devastating psychological toll. Soldiers who had grown up hearing about the greatness of German engineering now depended on the adversary's leftovers. And more, they began to respect them. Many reported their surprise at finding that the turrets rotated smoothly, that the engine was reliable even after days of downtime, that the ammunition was plentiful and functional. Wehrmacht reports began listing Sherman models with positive comments: good mobility, quick to maneuver, excellent in muddy terrain. The machine, made to be disposable, had become reliable. And this reliability, more than any caliber or armor, was what Germany could no longer replicate. They could still build killing machines, but they could not keep them alive. The enemy does. The forced adaptation of the Shermans in the German battalions marks the final moment of the doctrinal surrender. By the time even the enemy comes to depend on his equipment, the war has already been lost, not in the field, but in the foundry, in the design, on the assembly line. American industry had proved not only dominant, but generous to the point of allowing even the adversary to take advantage of its fruits. A tank made to be mass-produced, discarded, unceremoniously replaced, became in practice more valuable than the icons of Nazi engineering. Not for the glory, but for the presence, by function, by availability. In the end, the United States had created something more powerful than the best tank. They created enough tank which not only served their soldiers, but which, against all odds, would also serve their enemy. In the next chapter, we go to the interior of American factories, where the logic that created the Sherman multiplied in trucks, ships, planes, and ammunition. Because the secret of victory was not the design. It was the production line, and she was still far from stopping. In the distance, the field looks calm. Tanks advance slowly, supply columns snake along the roads, troops rest under makeshift tarps. But under this apparent tranquility operates the real engine of modern warfare, the depots. On each Allied front, from Normandy to Sicily, from Belgium to the Pacific, there are entire zones dedicated only to storing, organizing, and distributing. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, engines, turrets, radios, rations, uniforms, tires. With each kilometer conquered, the United States establishes a new supply line. It is a living, synchronized system, mathematically fed by a rearguard that never sleeps. As Germany calculates where to fuel its next Tiger, the Americans have already unloaded enough parts to rebuild 2 entire battalions on 3 different continents. Mobile workshops operate 24 hours a day, with specialized technicians able to recover damaged tanks within 12 hours. A Sherman hit in the morning may be back in combat by late afternoon, with a new turret, new ammunition, and the same crew. The secret? Absolute standardization. Each combat unit works with interchangeable parts, adapted for any theater of operations. French, British, Canadian, Polish, all get the same basic models. This transforms the complexity of war into a simple, straightforward, and scalable logistical system. The Germans can't keep up. To move a Tiger for 100 kilometers, it takes several fuel trucks, a safe route, a support convoy, and weeks of planning. And even then, it can break. The Americans, on the other hand, dispatch trains, planes, and ships with thousands of tons of supplies a week, just to maintain an active front. By 1944, the US Army used more than 450,000 logistics vehicles in Europe alone. GMC deuce-and-a-half trucks formed uninterrupted columns, transporting everything from the front to the rear. It was war on wheels, not to attack, but to keep the wheels running, and this gear was unbeatable. In German intelligence reports, a recurring expression begins to emerge: offensive abundance. It was not enough to have more. It was knowing how to use more, and the Americans knew. A Wehrmacht officer, interrogated in 1945, bitterly declared, "It doesn't matter how many tanks we destroy. The next day they were back, as if they had been born from the ground." The phrase was not a metaphor. It was logistics in its purest state. Because while American factories delivered 4,000 tanks a month, Allied depots organized each delivery with surgical precision. In Antwerp, one of the largest ports of the campaign in Europe, more than 20,000 tons of supplies were disembarked daily. These materials traveled across the continent along makeshift tracks, salvaged railways, and protected highways, all operating on a millimeter schedule. The Sherman was just the visible end of a logistical iceberg that enveloped hundreds of thousands of men and machines. And that infrastructure did more than keep the fight going. It created the feeling of inevitability. The German resistance was beginning to falter not only because of the losses, but because of the fatigue of fighting an enemy that never seemed to run out of resources. American depots became legends among combatants. There were stories of Allied outposts receiving more spare parts than available tanks. Ammunition carried in excess was used as ballast. Fuel in gigantic drums was abandoned in the field, as replacement was guaranteed. By comparison, the German army rationed even for elite units. Panzer grenadiers, who were supposed to operate as spearheads, were often given only 3 days' worth of ammunition. Then it was a matter of waiting. And waiting, in a war against American industry, was the same as losing. Pause for a number that reveals the abyss. In 1944, the United States produced 8.6 billion liters of aviation fuel. Germany produced 556 million. The difference is more than 15 times. This meant that while the Germans decided between fueling their fighters or their tanks, the Americans fueled both and still sent fuel to their allies. If this difference surprised you, write in the comments. Shocking data. Because this war was not won with fire alone, it was won with reservations. On the battlefield, this abundance translated into permanence. An American tank was seen more than once. One crew returned to the same position, with supplies, reinforcements, air support. The Germans, even when they shot down one unit, knew another would come. And this perception eroded morale. The quiet supremacy of American logistics needed no propaganda. It was felt in the daily life of war, an army that never stopped, never ran out, never retreated for lack of resources. And while Reich propaganda still extolled mobile warfare, the tanks were at a standstill, waiting for parts, by fuel, for reinforcements that didn't come. In the rear, the Americans were already preparing the next phase of the war. Deposits didn't just replace losses, they anticipated campaigns. Thousands of tons of supplies were positioned weeks before D-Day. Entire trains were diverted to fuel future offensives. The US military didn't just fight, he planned to fight more, best, and for longer. Every nut, every bolt, every bodywork set aside in the Allied depots was a reminder that this war was being won not by tactical genius, but by absolute dominance of the rear. In the next chapter, we will enter the docks of New York, the trains of Ohio, the foundries of Chicago. We will see how a continental nation far from war built not only tanks, but victory itself. Because what the Germans didn't know is that while they were fighting with everything they had, the Americans hadn't even used everything they could yet. In the heart of America, the sound of victory was not the roar of cannons, but the rhythmic echo of assembly lines. In Detroit, Pittsburgh, Chicago, factories once dedicated to automobiles, tractors, and refrigerators were now spewing military steel on unimaginable scales. The Detroit tank arsenal, a symbol of this transformation, was not just an industrial facility, it was an extension of the battlefield. But contrary to what one would imagine, it was not soldiers, engineers, or military personnel who led this front. They were housewives. They were teenagers, just out of school. They were immigrants who barely spoke English. They were widows, retired veterans, recycled mechanics. Ordinary people united by an extraordinary purpose, to give their son, husband, brother a chance to come back alive. Every Sherman tank that came off the line came loaded with sweat, hope, and messages scrawled on the inside of the hull. Come home. That's your shield. For you, we fight from here. Workers worked 16-hour shifts without interruption, including on holidays. Christmas with the smell of oil. Independence Day among conveyor belts. Production became a civic religion. It was more than patriotism. It was collective survival. While Germany suffocated under bombing, material shortages, and a system of slave labor imposed by the Reich, the United States created a voluntary culture of productivity. Women took on previously unimaginable positions: welders, crane operators, line supervisors. Rosie the Riveter wasn't propaganda. It was statistics. More than 6 million women entered the war industry between 1941 and 1945. In many factories, they represented 50% of the workforce. Some worked with their children's portraits hanging on their uniforms. Others signed the sides of the tanks with lipstick. It was a war fought with welding towers and calloused fingers, and each piece fitted, each nut tightened, had a precise function on the global board. The American war machine was not cold. She was emotionally driven. Moved by love, fear, grief, and the promise of return, the American assembly line worked with mathematical precision. Production was segmented into phases, tested at each stage, and prepared for instant adaptation. If the field reported a problem with the tower, the line adjusted in days. If more armor, more internal space, more ammunition were needed, the project was redone in real time. In contrast, the Germans suffered from rigidity. Tanks produced with artisanal perfection were difficult to adapt. Changes took months. The Kassel plant, bombed in 1944, took weeks to resume some production. In Michigan, a snowstorm could knock out power, and even then, the arsenal maintained 70% of capacity with auxiliary generators. The American war was proof against unforeseen events. And then came the most symbolic fact. By the end of the war, the United States had produced 86,000 tanks, 5 million trucks, 6,000 ships, and 300,000 planes. Half of this came out of the hands of civilians who had never wielded a weapon. For every Tiger that Germany built with sweat and scarcity, the Americans delivered 40 Shermans with pace and constancy. The difference was not only in the quantity, but in the origin. One was done in factories surrounded by soldiers, the other in cities fueled by coffee and voluntarism. One was born out of fear, the other mobilization. This industrial victory was invisible on the maps, but absolute in the results. The battlefield was just the stage. The script had already been written by mechanics who gave up weekends, by mothers who learned to weld, by grandmothers who went back to work. The American rear became a strategic vanguard, and when the Shermans advanced across Europe, each of them carried not just ammunition, but the moral signature of an entire country. In the next chapter, we will see the opposite reflection, how Germany, even with its legendary tanks, failed to ignore the people's own strength. Because sometimes the line that defines victory is not the front line, it is the production line. In theory, the Tiger was invincible. In practice, it was unsustainable. As the war progressed, what German engineers called continuous improvement began to turn into a labyrinth with no way out. Each innovation required new tools, rare materials, specialists who were already dead or displaced, factories that could barely operate under Allied bombing. Was the armor increasing? The wheels had to be reinforced? Was the cannon changed? The tower needed to be redesigned. New optical systems required precision calibration, and the more powerful engines required fine-tuning of the transmission. The production line began to deform, stuck in its own demands. In 1942, the manufacture of a Tiger took an average of 300,000 hours of work. In 1944, this number was already over 450,000. A single tank required almost 500,000 human hours, while the Americans in the same period produced 4 Shermans in 48 minutes. The equation was beginning to bleed. The time it took to build a Tiger could now feed 2 entire battalions of the enemy. Sophistication, which was once a symbol of pride, has become a trap. Every extra detail needed components coming from specific factories. The gearbox was produced at a plant in Kassel, the engines in Vienna, optical sights in small workshops in Jena. When one of these locations was bombed, and all of them were, the ripple effect paralyzed production for weeks. There was no plan B, there were no redundant lines. Germany had built a centralized, delicate, and deeply vulnerable war machine. And to make matters worse, the High Command's response to this crisis was to double down. If Tiger could no longer be delivered at scale, the proposed solution was not to simplify, it was to create something even bigger. Königstiger was born, the Tiger King. The King Tiger was a marvel of military engineering, 180mm frontal armor, an 88 mm L-71 gun capable of destroying any Allied armor from 2,000 meters away, wide tracks to compensate for the weight of 70 tons. But this technical monstrosity hid an uncomfortable secret. It was, essentially, impractical. The tank consumed more than 500 liters of fuel to travel 100 kilometers, fuel that was already scarce. It was so heavy that it broke bridges, bogged down in wet terrain, required entire trains to be transported by rail. A broken King Tiger blocked entire roads. And even when it operated perfectly, Germany could not produce more than a handful a month. They arrived at the front as relics, not as reinforcements. The paradox was complete. The more advanced the tank, the more expensive, the slower, the rarer, and the more useless on a strategic scale. Meanwhile, the Shermans continued to arrive. On trains, on ships, in warehouses that no longer knew where to store so many chassis. The German logic had been reversed. The obsession with quality had destroyed the ability to fight, and the tankers themselves began to feel the weight of this choice. A panzer commander interviewed years later confessed the Tiger was magnificent, but it was like fighting a racehorse in a swamp. The picture couldn't be more accurate. The vicious cycle was closing. Germany needed tanks to defend the territory, but it could not produce them without raw materials. To obtain these raw materials, it needed to move forward. But to advance, it needed tanks. And the ones he had were sitting idle. No parts, no fuel, no crew. The Reich, which had started the war with the doctrine of the blitzkrieg, fast and efficient, now crawled with mechanical monsters that could barely move. The lightning war had become a war of attrition, and Germany, with its factories sold out and soldiers overstretched, had no way to win a war of attrition against the world's greatest industrial power. In the next chapter, we will see how the Allies, in addition to excelling in production and logistics, also began to evolve in doctrine and tactics. Because it wasn't enough to have more tanks, you had to know how to use them smartly. And the Americans, with their pragmatic humility, were about to prove that even the wrong tank can win, when it is in the right place, at the right time, and in overwhelming numbers. In the midst of the offensive in the Ardennes, December 1944, 2 armored vehicles rest in silence. A Sherman, hit in the flank, is towed by a support truck. A Tiger, with a transmission failure, waits in the same place. 48 hours later, the Sherman returns to the battlefield. The Tiger remains motionless, not for lack of bravery of its crew members, but for lack of parts, crane, and time. This difference, almost invisible to civilian eyes, was the line that separated presence from absence, victory from withdrawal. Maintenance had become the real battlefield, and the United States dominated it as it dominated the sky. Technically, the Tiger was a colossus, but for every hour of combat, it required up to 10 hours of specialized maintenance. Its suspension system was sophisticated but delicate. The transmission broke frequently. Replacing a single component could take days, if not weeks, and relied on custom-made parts. Field officials reported instances where Tigers remained out of action for more than 30 days, just waiting for a single gear to be transported. Sherman, on the other hand, operated under an opposite logic: modular, standardized, adaptable. For every 10 hours of combat, it required on average only 1 hour of basic maintenance, often performed by the crew themselves. If a system failed, it was replaced in minutes. If there was no correct part, a similar one was used, taken from trucks, jeeps, other tanks. The Sherman was made for improvisation, and this philosophy made him unstoppable. The modularity of the American design was its true shielding. In the field, this meant that damaged tanks returned to combat on the same day. Mobile workshops accompanied the battalions, with mechanics trained to change entire engines in less than 2 hours. The American tank didn't have to be perfect. I just needed to be present, and he was, always. German doctrine, stuck to excellence, watched in astonishment as the Shermans returned endlessly. A destroyed Tiger was a strategic loss. A destroyed Sherman was just replaced. And when it wasn't destroyed, it was repaired. Fast, silently, relentlessly. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. Germany, the cradle of genius and innovative engineers, could have opted for a simplified production line, for lighter tanks, for a philosophy focused on field efficiency. But he chose the opposite: the perfect machine. And the perfect machine, like any complex organism, cannot survive without an entire ecosystem in its favor. When that ecosystem collapsed, so did Hitler's dream of armored domination. Meanwhile, the Americans moved on, with their tanks that didn't boast of glory, but just worked. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content about the silent gears of victory. Because history is not only made by heroes with rifles, but by mechanics with wrenches. In the next chapter, we will enter the field of doctrine, because it's not enough to have the right tank, you need to know how to use it. And the Americans were about to transform what was seen as an inferior vehicle. In siege, weapon, flank, and absolute domination, when the mind aligns itself with the machine, even the improbable becomes inevitable. In the devastated silence of the Hürtgen forest, a Tiger burned. Next to it, 5 bodies still attached to the interior of the tower. They had not fled. They had not tried to escape. They fought to the end as they were instructed. In the same sector, 300 meters away, a Sherman had also been hit, but it was empty. The crew, minutes before impact, had abandoned the vehicle after the commander's order. Saving yourselves is the mission now. They were found unharmed, already relocated to another armored vehicle the next day. The scene is emblematic. What differentiates these two endings is not just the armor or the caliber. It is the philosophy that built them. From the beginning of the conflict, American doctrine prioritized the preservation of man. The machines would always be replaced. Lives, never. This reflected directly on the way tanks were designed, used, and abandoned. The Sherman, although technically inferior to the Tiger in direct combat, was thought to be evacuated quickly. Its compartments were more accessible, the tank easier to get out of, and the emergency procedures standardized so everyone knew what to do in seconds. The result? Much higher survival rates among crews. On average, less than 3% of Sherman's crews died from total loss of armor. Among the Tigers, the statistic was grim. 75% did not return. The contrast wasn't just technical, it was moral. The Americans trained their men to abandon the machine when necessary. The order was clear: preserving the operator is worth more than the equipment. In Germany, the machine was seen as a national symbol. A lost Tiger was an affront to the war effort. Many commanders were given direct instructions not to abandon the vehicle at the risk of cutting off supplies or disciplinary punishment. The idolatry of the machine blinded human logic, and while German tanks turned into steel graves, Americans kept reappearing, the same faces in new hulls, like ghosts of an industry that never stopped. This philosophical difference also shaped the morale of the troops. An American tanker knew he was part of a system that valued his life. This generated confidence, initiative, and greater adaptability. German tankers, often exhausted veterans, knew they were caught in a moving trap, magnificent but fatal. General Heinz Guderian himself, architect of German armored warfare, wrote in his diary, "We created magnificent tanks, but we did not create an army that could sustain them." The phrase echoes the tragedy of an empire that invested in steel but ignored blood. And the cost was not just tactical, it was psychological. Entire American crews, even after losses, could regroup. Retrained, relocated in a matter of days. This created a learning cycle in the field. A commander who survived the 3rd Sherman knew more than many generals. In Germany, this knowledge died with the crew. The learning curve was constantly reset. Each crew destroyed was more than a casualty. It was the loss of accumulated experience, of developed reflexes, of combat memory. It was like erasing the chalkboard before class ended. The American doctrine, often derided by enemy propaganda as industrial cowardice, turned out to be, in fact, the most pragmatic manifestation of a war that had ceased to be chivalrous. In an all-out war, the winner is the one who knows where the value is. And the value, the Americans knew, was in the human being. The machine, no matter how powerful, could always be replaced. But the man who guided her was the real weapon. And if this man lived, he could fight once more and win. In the next chapter, we will reveal how this doctrine was taken to the extreme. Tanks disassembled, transported on ships across continents, reassembled under bombardment, and still operational in less than 24 hours. Because the American victory did not come only from the field. It came from the brutal understanding that winning a war isn't just about destroying more. It's about losing less. At the end of the war, spreadsheets spoke louder than speeches. In every cell filled with numbers, every line crossed by percentages, lay the true judgment of military effectiveness. The scales did not tip toward the most feared, nor the most glorified. She bent to the most constant. And in that silent courtroom, the verdict was incontestable. Sherman beat Tiger, not because it is more powerful, but for always being there. The cold comparison between the two reveals a reality that legends do not like to tell. Each Tiger required, on average, 450,000 hours of production, adding design, manufacturing, transportation, and field preparation. A Sherman, 18,000. In other words, while Germany was building a Tiger, the United States was putting 25 Shermans into operation. And at the end of the process, there was still time to send spare parts and form complete crews. Fuel consumption draws another mechanical tragedy. For every mile traveled, a Tiger consumed about 5.5 times more fuel than a Sherman. In a war where supply lines were priority targets, this meant that the Tiger often lost the battle before encountering it. What good is a supertank that can't leave the shed? The fuel that powered a Tiger for a day powered an entire division of Shermans for nearly a week. The maintenance statistics are even more severe. For every hour of maintenance on a Sherman, a Tiger required 100, a ratio of 100 to 1. This turned every battle won by a Tiger into a logistical defeat. Because while it was being towed, refueled, and dismantled by specialists, 10 other Shermans had already been recovered and sent back to the front. The training time also exposes the doctrinal chasm. A Tiger crew required months of technical instruction, familiarization with highly complex systems, and model-specific testing, since no two Tigers were exactly alike. Shermans, on the other hand, could be operated on by recruits with only 12 weeks of basic training. The standardization of the model, with simple manuals and interchangeable parts, allowed for an accelerated learning curve that could be replicated on a large scale. The United States Army did not just train soldiers, he multiplied them. With doctrine, with method, and with clarity of objectives, it was a men's assembly line as efficient as the steel one. And then, the inevitable question: how many Tigers were really ready for combat at the end of the war? By May 1945, of the 1,847 produced, fewer than 150 were operational. Most had been destroyed, abandoned, or captured, often not in direct combat, but due to unmaintainability, lack of fuel, or collapse of the logistics chain. The Shermans, on the other hand, even with constant losses, maintained availability rates above 80% throughout the campaigns. This means that while the Tiger was a high-cost risk, the Sherman was a certainty, and in war, certainties win. The final accounting is brutal in its clarity. The perfect tank cost more, demanded more, consumed more, failed more. The enough tank did what needed to be done every time. The Tiger could dominate a battle, the Sherman an entire war. Germany has invested its soul in technical supremacy. The United States bet on logistical supremacy. And in the end, what triumphed was not the most lethal machine, but the most resilient. It wasn't the roar of the 88-minute gun, but the constant sound of the assembly lines in Detroit. If you were surprised by these proportions, comment below with "Logistics wins," because true victory starts behind the scenes, where bolts are worth more than medals. In the next chapter, we will go through the rubble left by this industrial avalanche. Because more than tanks in the field, the Americans left a message: modern warfare belongs to those who know how to manufacture tomorrow. And that future was sealed with steel, sweat, and mathematics. In the steel corridors of American factories, the noise of riveting machines set the pace for a new era. There, the tank was not treated as art, it was a product. There was no engineer's signature on the side of the hull, no obsession with perfect curves or impeccable finish. There was rough welding, assembly line, and a silent conviction: speed conquers vanity. While Germany invested in war craftsmanship, building tanks as if they were mechanical jewels, the United States transformed the conflict into an industrial operation. A Sherman wasn't born of a genius. He was born of a conveyor belt, driven by hundreds of anonymous hands that operated with method, not inspiration. And this is where the final contrast is established. World War II was not won by the most lethal tank, but by the tank that arrived first, in greater numbers, and returned to combat even after being wounded. The Tiger was a celebration of the engineer, a machine designed with passion, pride, and perfectionism. Each unit was unique, hand-adjusted, with non-standard parts that required specific adaptations. It was the tank that every officer wanted to command, but that no nation could sustain. Its 80-millimeter gun could destroy a Sherman more than 2 kilometers away. Its frontal armor withstood almost anything. But with each piece changed, it required artisanal logistics. An out-of-service Tiger was a puzzle on the field. The Sherman, with all its limitations, was a machine made to keep going. Wheels, motors, towers, transmitters. Everything fit together. Everything was compatible. One damaged tank could be cannibalized in minutes to repair 3 others. And when the Allied convoys advanced, they didn't just take tanks. They carried parts, spare crews, tools, and fuel. It was a war about continuity. The US Army didn't need isolated heroes. It needed reliable systems. And that's what he built. Each platoon of Shermans was a cog in a much larger machine where no one was irreplaceable. From the commander to the radio operator, everyone could be replaced. all trained under the same manual, operating identical machines with replicable strategies. The German army, on the other hand, became hostage to its own talents. The best tankers died without replacements to match. Engineers grew old with plans in their hands that they could no longer execute. And each new technical innovation became a burden, a new part to be produced under bombardment, a new variable in a system that allowed no mistakes. The war, in the end, did not reward the most feared tank. It rewarded what was there, what could cross oceans in disassembled ships. The one that ran with an airplane or truck engine, depending on the need, which could be repaired with parts borrowed from jeeps. What a young man from Iowa could learn to drive in 3 months. Sherman didn't become a legend, he became a standard. The Tiger became a monument, static, admired and out of combat. This is where the lesson reveals itself in its crudest form. Germany bet on genius. The United States in predictability. And in a war that lasted for years, it was reliable repetition, not rare brilliance, that decided the future. It doesn't matter how powerful a tank is if it's immobilized. It doesn't matter how accurate your aim is if your ammunition doesn't arrive. The victory was sealed by those who understood, first of all, the value of a second saved, of a simplified process, of a replicable system. In the next chapter, we will come to the end of this march of steel and calculation, because what remains, after the dust settles, is not only the wreckage of the tanks, but the question that echoes. What if the Germans had understood this in time? Fort Knox, 1985. In a quiet hall, war veterans meet again. On one side of the table, former commanders of Shermans. On the other, scorers who once inhabited the thick hull of the Tigers. There is no hatred, only memory. One of them, already with white hair, sums up what the numbers and battles had tried to say for decades. You fought with excellence, we with arithmetic. And in war, arithmetic always wins. And so ends the dilemma that began with a promise of superiority. Germany bet everything on the perfect machine and forgot to multiply it. Each Tiger was an individual victory, but the war required systems, scale, and replacement. In the end, the German army collapsed under the weight of its own ideal, collapsing not for lack of courage or ingenuity, but for not understanding that logistics is not a detail. It is the battlefield itself. The Second World War left its mark on every continent, but the deepest scar is perhaps invisible. It definitively separated the time of isolated genius and the time of the coordinated machine. It was the moment when nations learned, with blood and steel, that bravery without replacement is martyrdom, and that a tank is only invincible if it can fight tomorrow. American doctrine won not just with steel, but with a philosophy that treated every soldier as irreplaceable and every machine as disposable. Modern warfare has proved to be a merciless equation, and victory has smiled on those who have understood that efficiency, volume, and repetition are worth more than brilliance and rarity. Because tanks don't win alone. Production chains, yes. It was General Heinz Guderian who, decades later, summed up the defeat with a phrase that few had the courage to say out loud. We were defeated by trucks, for logistics that did not stop, by factories that never slept. This admission is not just a technical epitaph, it is the bitter reflection of an ideology that has fallen in love with complexity and forgotten continuity. If you value research, historical truth, and want to see more facts like this being revealed without filters, like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. This allows us to continue bringing to light the wars that have been decided far from the front. And tell us here in the comments, what was the most shocking data you discovered today? Mass production, the survival rate, field maintenance? We want to hear your reaction. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.